All right, well, I see it's 1 o'clock exactly, so let's get started. Good afternoon. We're very glad to have you here.
Shelley, this is Tara. I need you on camera. I need interpreters on camera.
I am on camera.
I am on camera.
Got it. Let's make sure I've got my settings set the way I want them. I guess that's what I wanted. How's that look, everybody?
Well, it didn't change for me, but as long as it changed for you.
Yeah, it looks the same.
All right. Well, my name is Shelley Richardson. I'm the Executive Director of the Statewide Independent Living Council of Illinois, and we're so glad to be able to host a webinar on this very, very important and salient topic today. So I want to give you a brief description of myself. I'm a middle-aged white female with glasses and short red hair, and you can't really see my top, but I am sitting in my office here in Springfield, Illinois. My preferred pronouns are she, her, and hers. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. You'll see that there's a tab at the bottom that has question and answer, and there's a tab that has chat. If you are having some kind of technical difficulty or want to ask a question, we would ask that you put that in the chat and reserve your questions for the question and answer area. So if you will just put your questions in that chat, as it pertains to what Cheryl is going on, Tara will be monitoring that, and she will read the questions, or Cheryl will be able to read the questions, either one, and we can kind of keep ahead of everything. So please do not hesitate to ask your questions. And without further to talk about, I would like to introduce our presenter today. Her name is Cheryl Jansen. She's the Public Policy Director for Equip for Equality. And I'm going to turn it over to her, and she's going to tell you a little more about herself and their work at Equip for Equality.
Great.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Thank you, Shelley, and thank you to Silk for inviting us to do this webinar today. As Shelley said, I am the Public Policy Director at Equip for Equality. And for those of you who are not familiar with Equip for Equality, we are the federally mandated protection and advocacy system, or the P&A, for people with disabilities in Illinois. And Congress set up this system back in the 90s after some very horrific conditions at a state-operated school for children with developmental disabilities came to light. And Congress felt the need to establish some kind of a system to protect and advocate for the rights of people with disabilities. And so that was really the beginning of the P&A system. And over the years, additional programs have been created so that now we really provide protection and advocacy for all types of disabilities, for both children and adults. The mission of Equip for Equality is to advance the human and civil rights of children and adults with disabilities across the state of Illinois. And if you don't know, we provide self-advocacy assistance and training. We provide legal representation in both individual cases and systemic cases. We monitor in settings, both public and private, that serve people with disabilities to make sure that adequate, appropriate services are being provided and that the people being served are free of abuse and neglect. And we also engage in public policy advocacy, which is the program that I fit in with. I've been with Equip for almost 17 years. always in the public policy program. For about 13 of those years, I was the head of our voting rights program. And I am still very actively involved in that program, but am not doing the overall management and supervision of the program, so that I'm actually able to spend more time on doing public policy advocacy. But voting rights and the importance of voting is always near and dear to my heart, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today about that topic. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So let's talk a little about the agenda for today. I want to start out talking about the importance of voting, and then discuss some of the barriers that people with disabilities have faced when
Cheryl,
they.
I'm sorry, this is
Yes.
Tara. We're still having trouble seeing interpreters, so let's pause very quickly.
Sure.
Laura, I'm gonna unpin you or unspotlight you, and you do whatever you need to do. Can you do that?
Can you make me co-host?
Yes.
No, I'm spotlighted, so. So we'll see if they can see me or not.
Can we see interpreters now? Catherine, Brianna? Laura is now visible. Okay, I apologize, everyone. Yes.
Hey, things happen all the time. At least we got it corrected. Okay, go ahead, Cheryl. Thank you.
Sure. So I just want to tell you a little about the agenda for today's program. First off, we're going to talk about why voting is important, and then discuss some of the barriers that people with disabilities have faced when they go to register and to vote. And then I'll review a couple of major federal voting rights statutes or laws with regard to the voting rights of people with disabilities. And those are the Americans with Disabilities Act and also the Help America Vote Act. And I see that on this slide, I actually have a typo. It is the Help America Vote Act of 2002. And when we talk about it later, it will be correct there, but just to let you know. And then we're going to talk more broadly about your rights and the requirements and options that people have for voter registration and voting here in the state of Illinois. And many of these things will apply to all voters, although they also benefit all voters. And some of them are specifically for voters with disabilities. So we'll talk about both. Next slide, please. So why is voting important? I have a feeling that I'm preaching to the choir here and that you all know exactly why voting is so important, but I don't think we can hear it enough. So we'll talk about it a little more. Voting is a fundamental right for all United States citizens. And it's the way that we choose our elected officials, and they're the ones who make decisions and rules and pass laws that affect our everyday lives. And by voting, we can help to decide who stays in office and who does not. And I will tell you that elected officials pay pretty close attention to who votes and who does not. And in my work with the General Assembly on legislation here in Illinois, I have heard from more than one legislator that if they have a constituent, meaning somebody who lives in their district, who comes to them with a problem, they pay close attention. And even if they hear from 2 or 3 people about that very same problem or issue, it will prompt them to take some action. So it's really important that we're registered and that we vote, and that when we interact with our legislators, we let them know that they represent us. So in a nutshell, if where you live and who you live with, getting health care, having access to quality education, jobs, getting the services you want and need, and enforcing your rights under the ADA are important to you, then we have to be sure to vote every election, including the one that is now only 3 weeks away on November 8th. Slide, please. So for literally decades, people with disabilities have been underrepresented at the polls. And what this means is that fewer people with disabilities who are eligible to register and to vote do so than people without disabilities. And there's really a number of reasons why this has happened over time. Some of those are that we have inaccessible polling places and equipment. The people with disabilities often face discriminatory practices and attitudes of election officials, poll workers, guardians, and caretakers. For many years, the lack of accessible, affordable transportation to the polls was a major issue for people with disabilities. And that's why vote by mail has become even more important and has allowed even more people to vote. And then finally, and really the reason we're here today, is that many people don't know much about the rights of people with disabilities. That includes people with disabilities themselves, their family members, their guardians, election officials and poll workers, and even the people who provide services to them. So education is a critical part of overcoming some of these barriers. And I hope that later on in the conversation, some of you will tell me about some of the barriers that you or the people you work with may have faced when they've attempted to register to vote and vote. Next slide, please. So moving on, oh, and I really, although this is not on the slide, I wanted to just provide a little more information about the impact of the barriers to voting. And actually, in recent years, there's been an increase in turnout of voters with disabilities. And so that's some good news that we can celebrate. Although there's still a disparity when you compare it to the number of voters without disabilities who vote. But there are a couple of researchers at Rutgers University who've been studying this issue for years and years, and their names are Douglas Cruz and Lisa Scher. And so they analyzed the results of the last general election, presidential election in 2020, and found that 17.7 million, or 62%, of people with disabilities voted during that election. And of course, that's nationwide. And that is an increase from 16 million, or 56%, in 2016. And many states made it easier for people to vote during the pandemic. And I'm sure that that was a factor in the change in these numbers. But even so, 1.95 million, or 11% of people with disabilities had trouble voting, although that number is down from 26% in 2012. But regardless, voters with disabilities were still almost twice as likely as voters without disabilities to report problems when they voted. And I think it will be really interesting to see how, if any, those numbers change in upcoming elections, particularly major elections like presidential elections, which we'll have again in 2024. Because as I'm sure you know, since the 2020 election, there have been a number of states that have passed laws that make it more difficult for people to vote. And so we may again see a fluctuation in those numbers. And I hope that it won't be too severe if there is a decrease in the number, and hope also that there may be some legislative changes that occur between now and 2024 that would enable more people to freely vote. So now we'll move on to federal laws about the voting rights of people with disabilities. As I said, the first is the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, which most of us refer to as the ADA. And Title II of the ADA requires that people with disabilities have access to all state and local government programs and activities, and that includes voting. It covers everything that state and local government entities do, including county clerks and boards of election, who are the ones who administer our elections. Title II requires that people with disabilities have access and opportunity to exercise their right to vote that's equal to that provided to people without disabilities. It also, under the ADA, there are regulations that set forth guidelines and requirements for the accessibility of polling places. So those requirements determine the space in which people vote, and that includes the width of hallways and doorways, ensuring that there's enough turning space at the voting machine, and that there are spaces for walkways and parking spaces outside polling places are sufficient to allow unimpeded access to the polling place. Should also say that with regard to the requirements of Title II, when we talk about people having an opportunity to exercise their right to vote that is equal to that provided to people without disabilities, that includes equally effective communication with voters with disabilities. Next slide, please. So the requirements that I was talking about that really relate to the architecture and the spaces that are in and around a polling place are part of a pretty comprehensive ADA checklist to ensure that spaces that are in and around polling places comply with federal law. And so that means that parking areas and drop-off areas, exterior routes, the entrances to polling places, the interior routes, and the voting booths must be accessible to voters with disabilities. Although, as we've seen from some of the issues that we've discussed earlier, although that's the requirement, it is not always the case, and we still have work to do. Next slide, please. And the second federal law about the voting rights of people with disabilities is the Help America Vote Act of 2002. And we usually refer to this as HAVA. And so HAVA was passed to address problems that occurred with voting systems and voter access in the 2000 presidential election. And I don't know how many of you are old enough to have to remember or have participated in that election. I certainly am old enough. And at the time, ballots were literally punch cards, so that next to the candidates' names, there was a little perforated kind of a rectangle that you had to take a pen or a pencil and punch out to indicate who you were voting for. That was a less than scientific way to register a vote. And as it turned out, more than 2 million of those punch card ballots were disqualified in that election. And the problem was something that were known as hanging chads, meaning that that little rectangle was not completely pushed out and was just hanging there. And so the question became whether someone made a mistake or whether they actually intended to vote for that person. And so, as I say, millions of ballots were taken out of the running for that election because of that. And it delayed and affected the election results. And ultimately, the courts had to decide who had won the presidential election in the year 2000. But HAVA is intended to improve access to the electoral process for all U.S. citizens. It has some specific provisions for voters with disabilities. And so it is because of HAVA that every polling place is required to have at least one accessible voting machine. And it's also a provision of HAVA that people with disabilities must be able to vote privately and independently. And this is very important, and it continues to be an issue, I'm sorry to say. And I'd also like to add that when HAVA was being written and negotiated, there was some very strong and effective advocacy by people with disabilities to make sure that at least some of the barriers that they had faced when they go to register or vote would be addressed in this new law. And so it's really because of that advocacy that we have these two very important provisions. One other thing that HAVA requires is that state elections board or counties have to have state election offices. So in our case, it would be the State Board of Elections, must have a complaint process for rights violations. So if something would occur when you go to vote on election day that you believe is a violation of your rights under either federal or state law, you can file an administrative complaint with the State Board of Elections. And in some cases, they will review documents. In others, they will review documents and also have witnesses in a hearing to determine if, in fact, the individual's rights have been violated. And so I think it's important that people know that that is an option. And this is something that Equip for Equality can assist voters with. We can help with filing a complaint with the State Board of Elections if something happens to you when you go to vote. Next slide, please. I'd also like to mention that as the protection and advocacy system in Illinois, Equip for Equality receives federal funds under HAVA to help ensure that people with disabilities can fully participate in the electoral process. And that includes registering to vote, casting a vote, and also accessing polling places. And so voting rights and voting issues are a core part of our mission and responsibility as the P&A. And we have deputy registrars on our staff who can register people to vote. We send voting information as part of our intake packets. We provide people with applications to register to vote if they so request during intake. We go out to schools, we go out to facilities, both private and public, that serve people with disabilities to conduct voter registration. We provide trainings and presentations like this about the voting rights of people with disabilities. We also have done for a number of years polling place accessibility surveys on election day and try to work with election officials to improve accessibility of their polling places. We have trained election officials on the proper way to conduct that kind of a survey. We have provided training to election judges on interfacing with voters with disabilities and what they should be prepared to do and to provide. And so this is something that really for us is an ongoing part of our mission. But taken together, HAVA and Title II of the ADA require election authorities to ensure that people with disabilities can vote privately and without assistance. And that's true whether they vote in person at a polling place or by mail from home. Next slide, please. So if you want to register to vote here in Illinois, what do you need to do? Well, the basic requirements to vote in an election, the basic requirement to vote in an election is that you have to be registered to vote. And so that it's a two-step process. It's great to register, but then you need to follow up and go out and vote. And to register to vote, here are the requirements in Illinois. You must be a US citizen. You must be 17 years old on or before the date of the primary election, as long as you turn 18 on or before the date of the general election. And so that is something that has been expanded in recent years. You also need to have lived in your election precinct for at least 30 days before election day. So under what circumstances do you need to register to vote? Obviously, if you've never registered before, you need to do so. But also if you have moved and changed your address, you need to update your voter registration information. And you also have to do that if you have changed your name since you were last registered and voted. And like many things we're going to talk about today, I know that Illinois is not always what you would call a trendsetter or the most progressive state. But one thing that has been done here that has been beneficial really to all potential voters is that voter registration has been expanded. There was a time when there was a deadline to register to vote. And if you didn't register by that date, you were out of luck for that election. You could not vote and you would have to wait until the next election. Now in Illinois, you can register to vote and vote through election day. So there are really very few reasons, why you shouldn't or couldn't be able to vote, because we have far more opportunities now than we had in the past. Next slide, please. So some things that you should know when you go to register is that you have to have some identification to prove that you are who you say you are. And state law requires that you have at least 2 pieces of ID, and one of them has to show your current address. So I've listed here some examples of things that you can use as ID in order to register to vote. These are not the only things, but these are some of probably the most common things that people use. And so that includes your driver's license, an Illinois state ID card, a public assistance ID card, and that includes Medicaid cards, a Social Security card, a library card, a recent utility bill that shows your address, a credit card, or your birth certificate. So there's, a lot of options for what you can use and bring with you when you go to register in order to identify yourself.
Cheryl, this is Shelley.
Yes.
I want to ask a clarifying question.
Sure.
So let's say the person has moved and they haven't changed their address on their driver's license or their state ID. They can still use the old state ID with their old address as long as they have a piece of mail with their current address.
That is correct. So then in that case, say you move to a new apartment or house, bring in a utility bill that shows where you're currently living. One of those pieces needs to have your current address. And your state ID card, of course, with a photo is going to identify you regardless of the address. So yes, that is correct, Shelley.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. Thank you. I was just going to say, next slide, please, that you're on top of it, Tara. Thank you. So what are the options for how and where you can register to vote? And as I said before, Illinois has done a lot in the last few years to increase and expand the ability of people to register and to vote. So you can register in person by going to your local election authority office or a city or village or township office. And some schools and some public libraries also offer voter registration. And so you should inquire if that's where you're looking to go, to call a local school or a local public library and see if that is an option at their facility. You can also apply in person, register in person when you apply for services at various state agencies. And this includes Secretary of State offices, their driver's license facilities, and that includes when you renew your license or if you're getting a license for a first time. Also includes the Department on Aging, the Department of Healthcare and Family Services, the Department of Public Health, and the Department of Human Services. And that includes the divisions of mental health, developmental disabilities, and rehabilitation services. There's actually a federal law that requires these types of agencies to offer voter registration when people go to apply for services. And I'd be very curious to know, perhaps at the end, if any of you, or if you know of anyone who has gone to apply for services at any of these agencies or facilities and been offered to register to vote. There is a federal law that, as I said, that requires it, but there's also been some research to show that it doesn't happen on a regular basis. And so I would love to hear if anyone has had an experience where they were asked or were not asked, to see how that pans out.
Cheryl, this is Shelley again. I
Yeah.
also want to remind everyone that I know many centers for independent living have people on staff that can register voters, so they may
Oh,
want
yeah.
to check with their local center.
Absolutely. Yeah, there are a lot of organizations that have deputy registrars on staff. And so, yes, if you're affiliated with an organization or you're a client of an organization, ask them if they have deputy registrars on staff that could register you or someone else who's interested to vote.
Cheryl, this is Tara. A good time to take
Yeah.
a couple questions?
Yes, absolutely.
I'm going to jump straight to the ones pertaining to what we're talking about right now. If
Okay.
I updated my address and received my new registration card with my new address, should I be required to show a state ID also in order to vote?
No, as long as you provided some documentation of your new address when you updated your information, then that shouldn't be necessary. If you didn't, if you updated your information, but you didn't provide any proof of the new address, then actually what they should do is your election authority should contact you to let you know that you need to provide certain information for your registration to be, or update to be valid. They should let you know if you have not provided what was needed.
And this same writer says that she recently went and got a new driver's license at Department of Motor Vehicles, and they did ask her about renewing.
Good. Well, I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah. Any other questions,
I
Tara?
had one question, which was about statistics from earlier. How
Okay.
are data statistics tracked for people with disabilities and minorities when it's not asked or tracked at the time of voting if you have a disability or are a minority?
And you know what? I would really need to go back and take a look at the Rutgers University's research process, because I know there are some publicly available records that they tap into to do this. But I don't remember, what the source is right now, but I'd be happy to find it afterwards, and I can email it to Shelley and she can send that out. Happy to do that. I don't want to misquote what it was.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
And one last. If you go to the early voting site and are provided with a provisional ballot because you don't have sufficient ID at the time, what should you do? Do you have any tips?
What you should do is if you're satisfied that you have not provided whatever it is they're requiring for you, go ahead and vote your provisional ballot. And then you have a certain amount of time, and I can't remember the number of days, but you would get information from the elections office telling you that you have X number of days to supply whatever that missing information was. And so you should follow up and do it within that prescribed time frame. Not be any problem with your ballot being counted.
That's all the questions right now. Thank you, Cheryl.
Okay. Then we'll move to the next slide. So other places where you can register to vote, or options to register to vote. You can do it by mail. You fill out a voter registration form and mail it to your local election office. You can get this form from a number of places, and that includes from your local election authority or by downloading it from the Illinois State Board of Elections website at www.elections.il.gov. However, you should know, if you have not already registered to vote for the upcoming election, you cannot now register to vote by mail. That option has ended on October 11th. So you would have to use one of the other ways to register to vote that we're going to talk about after that date. You can also, if you have access to a computer, you can register to vote online. And I've included here the web address to access in order to do that. And you have to have a couple things in order to register to vote online. One is you need a valid email address. And you'll also have to provide a valid driver's license number or a state ID card number. And the last day for this upcoming November 8th election to register to vote online is October 23rd. So that is coming up pretty quickly. And I think that's a Sunday. And so if you're going to take advantage of that option, it's something that you need to do this week.
One quick question. Is there a deadline
Sure.
to request a mail-in ballot?
There is a deadline to request a mail-in ballot, and I'm getting to that. So if you'll just put a pin in that for a minute, then we'll get to those deadlines. Next slide, please. So after you register to vote, no matter how you do it, you can check your voter registration status online at the State Board of Elections website by clicking on a link called Registration and Polling Place Information. And you can consider yourself registered to vote when you receive a voter ID card in the mail from the Board of Elections. And if you don't receive an ID card, say within 3 weeks of your registering to vote, then contact your election office just to make sure that it has been received and that you will be able to vote in the next election. Next slide. So as I said, if you don't register to vote within the normal timeframes, there is a new process. Well, I say new, but it's probably been 5 or more years that was put into place called grace period registration and voting. And so the beauty of this process is that it lets you register to vote or to update your address right through election day. You can do it on election day. The difference is, instead of just registering to vote, at the time that you register, you also have to vote your ballot. So you can't, wait and come back and vote at your polling place on election day, or wait for something to come to you in the mail. You will be required to vote your ballot at that time. So if you're using that process, be sure that you know how you intend to vote and to check whatever you need to check in order to feel that you can make an informed decision, because you will be required to do it right then and there. And so grace period registration is offered at your local election authority's office, also at early voting sites starting 15 days before the election, at permanent polling places, and at your polling place on election day. So there are lots of options taking you right up to and on election day. And this is something that, to find locations and the hours for grace period registration and voting, you should contact your local election authority about, and they can tell you where you need to go and what the hours are that it's available. So another option here in Illinois, as in many other states, is early voting. And this means that if you're a registered voter, you can vote before election day by going to an early voting location. Early voting starts 40 days before the election, and it continues until the day before election day. As with a lot of these things, before you vote, it's important to check with your local election authority about their hours and locations for early voting, so that you go to the right place and don't make a wasted trip. And as with all other polling places, by law, the early voting locations must be physically accessible. And so, of course, for this upcoming November 8th election, then early voting is available until November 7th. Next slide.
Okay. Would you like to take one question about that?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I'm sorry, I'm not monitoring chat, so please
That's right. I am.
hop in anytime.
If you have a current voter registration card with my current address, can I get a ballot to vote without any additional documentation?
Yes, you should not have to present. If you are a registered voter at your current address, you have a current voter registration status, you do not need to provide any documentation or identification to vote. And if you encountered an election judge or poll worker who tells you otherwise, they are mistaken. That is not necessary. And I hope that that will not occur, although I know we have had reports that on occasion people have been asked for that kind of identification. And we have no such requirement or law here in Illinois. So you should not need anything further. So as with many things here in Illinois, that both the time period and the number of hours that early voting is available have been expanded. And so we have a longer period of time and additional hours that you can go to an early voting center to vote. By law, early voting locations must be open during the 15 days before the election from 8:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. or 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. on weekdays. In the 8 days before the election, early voting locations must be open from 8:30 to 7 o'clock p.m. or 9 o'clock a.m. to 7 p.m. on weekdays, and 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. on Saturdays and holidays, and 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. on Sundays. So there are really many opportunities to early vote here in Illinois. And as you can see, there's some flexibility in the hours that the elections offices can be open. So it's good to call your local election office and make sure what hours they are adhering to for their early voting. And as I mentioned, the last day for early voting for the November 8th election is November 7th.
And I've got one more question for you, Cheryl. Where
Sure.
can a voter report voting law violations on the day the incident occurs?
I would say that if something occurs on election day, I would call your local election office to let them know what the problem or the issue is, to see if perhaps, something can be fixed or resolved. You can also report these things to the State Board of Elections. And you also then, after the fact, would have the option of filing a complaint with the State Board of Elections with regard to the problem or rights violation that you experienced. So you have several options. And I'm going to talk about something that we offer on election day that could be used as well. And we'll get to that at the end. Next slide, please. So now we're going to get to vote by mail. And as I said at the beginning, vote by mail really has helped voters with disabilities to participate in greater numbers in our electoral process. And of course, the benefits have been enjoyed by all eligible voters. But I think it, at least in part, accounts for the fact that there's been greater turnout among voters with disabilities than there has been in previous years. So you probably know that what we now call vote by mail used to be called absentee voting. And it was called that because you had to be absent from your election jurisdiction on election day in order to be able to vote an absentee ballot. And so if you were going to be, on vacation out of town, or you had a disability that would prevent you from accessing your polling place, then you could apply to vote by mail. Fortunately, Illinois did away with that a few years ago, and now anyone who wants to can vote using a vote by mail ballot. You don't have to provide any reason or excuse. And you can request an application for a vote by mail ballot through the mail, in person at your election office, or online from your local election authority. So you fill out the application and return it to your local election office, either in person or by mail. And you can request a vote by mail ballot 90 days before the election, up until 1 day before the election, if you do it in person, or 5 days before the election, if you make the application by mail or online. So in the first instance, when you're doing it in person, you can make that request until November 7th. And if you're doing it by mail or online, then you have to do it by November 3rd for this election. Next slide, please. If you apply to vote by mail in person, then you have the option of voting your ballot in your local election office while you're there. You don't have to. You could take it home and study it and fill it out and return it at a later time, but you do have the option of taking care of it right then and there. If you apply by mail or online, you will get a ballot in the mail, which you have to fill out and return to your election authority either by mail, in person, or in a designated drop box. And you should definitely call your election authority if you want to use a drop box to find out where they are located in your election jurisdiction. And then you also have to use the envelope that's given to you with the vote by mail ballot. You have to sign that envelope on the outside and then seal it as instructed and return it. If you return your ballot by mail, it has to be postmarked on or before Election Day. And it's important to know that with vote by mail, you can receive help marking your ballot if you wish. And if you return then your completed ballot by mail, the person who has helped you has to sign the envelope stating that they provided you with assistance. An additional option or feature that we now have here in Illinois is that under a law that was passed last year, Illinois voters can now permanently register to vote by mail, rather than apply to vote by mail for each and every election. And so under that new law, the election offices were required to send all registered voters a vote by mail application. And on that application, you then had the option of selecting either vote by mail just for this election or permanently. And if you mark permanently, you will automatically continue to receive vote by mail ballots without further application until you withdraw that request. So that is also something that is making the process more efficient and easier for voters. I'm seeing a comment that the interpreter is frozen.
I've taken over. Go ahead.
Okay. So another addition regarding vote by mail is remote accessible vote by mail. And this came about as a result of a new Illinois law that requires the State Board of Elections to provide a certified remote accessible vote by mail system, starting with the upcoming November 8th election, that allows voters with print disabilities to receive, mark, and verify their vote by mail ballots electronically using their own assistive technology at home or in their office, wherever that technology exists. And I wanted to let you know that this is legislation that Equip for Equality worked on in collaboration with the National Federation of the Blind of Illinois and the Illinois Council of the Blind and several other organizations over the last 2 years. And so it took some persistence, but we were able to accomplish at least this much during this last legislative session. And so, as defined by that new law, voters with print disabilities include people who are blind, have low vision, have cognitive impairments, learning disabilities, or manual dexterity limitations. And so that is not an inclusive list, but it basically covers disabilities that prevent effective reading, writing, or use of print materials. Next slide, please. To use this system, you should contact your local election authority when you apply for your vote by mail ballot to let them know that you want to receive an accessible ballot. And I say this because I am not sure that the election authorities or the State Board of Elections vote by mail application forms have caught up with this new law. And it may not provide an option on the form for you to receive a remote accessible vote by mail ballot. So if you're in a jurisdiction where that is not stated on the application, then call your local election authority and let them know that when they send a ballot, this is the type of ballot that you wish to receive. And I've included here the link to the page on the State Board of Elections website, where you could look up the contact information for your local election authority if you don't know, who that is or where it is. So that can be found there. So with remote accessible vote by mail, after you vote your ballot, the voter must print it out, sign it, and return it to the local election authority. And this is why this is an issue we're going to continue to work on, because the system as it now exists doesn't allow voters with print disabilities to return their voted ballots electronically. They still have to seek the assistance from a person without a print disability to complete the process. Next slide. Until Illinois passes a law that does allow voters with print disabilities to return their vote by mail ballots electronically, this new system will provide only a partial solution to the inaccessibility of vote by mail for voters with print disabilities. And in our opinion, and in the opinion of many other advocates, electronic ballot return is needed to give voters with print disabilities the ability to vote by mail privately and independently. And that is consistent with the requirements of HAVA and Title II of the ADA. And so Equip for Equality and also our partners during this last effort will be working to address this issue in the next legislative session. So you'll probably be hearing from us about this soon. So what if you need some assistance when you go to vote? That's perfectly fine. And if you need help voting, you can get help from any person that you choose, as long as that person isn't your employer or an officer in a union that you belong to, or is a candidate whose name is on the ballot. In other words, someone who is running for office. And outside of those three exceptions, you can choose anyone that you want to provide help when you vote. It does not need to be an adult. It does not need to be a registered voter. It doesn't need to be a relative. It doesn't need to be a guardian. It doesn't even need to be someone who speaks English. You should simply choose someone that you trust to help you with this very important function. And since we're mentioning guardians here, it's important for me to say that having a guardian does not affect your right to vote. You do not need permission to vote if you have a guardian. And so that is definitely something to keep in mind, although I'm not sure it's something that we've encountered recently. In the past, there were some issues that came up with guardians telling a service provider that their ward could not vote. And there have also been sometimes election judges who perhaps knew personally the guardian, and the voter with a disability was aware of the relationship and took the position that because of the guardianship, the person wasn't eligible to vote. And that is absolutely not true. Obviously, whoever you choose to help you when you go to vote isn't allowed to try to influence you to vote in any way. That is very important. And I have actually seen an election judge not interfere, but question and cause someone to stop, quote, assisting a person who was voting when it was very clear by his words and deeds that he was trying to influence who that person voted for. And that, whether you're a person with a disability or not, that's not allowed. If you decide that you need help with voting, but you don't have someone who can go with you, or you realize when you get there that you could use some assistance and you don't have someone there, you can ask the election judges for help when you vote. And if you do that, then there have to be 2 election judges, one from each major political party. In other words, 1 Democrat and 1 Republican, to assist you in the voting booth. If you ask for help from the election judges, then you'll have to sign a paper stating that you requested assistance from them.
This is Tara. There's one question.
Sure.
Where can a person get a sample voting ballot for their district in advance of voting?
You should be able to get that from your local election authority. And you tell them, in what district you live and which ballot you're interested in seeing, and you should be able to get that. It may also, I'm not absolutely certain, it may also be available on the State Board of Elections website, but I think your best bet would be to contact your local election office. And so there are other things that can be used to help with voting if it's needed. And those include, aids such as instructions that are printed in large type. And these should be displayed at each registration facility and each polling place. Every polling place should also have a magnifying lens to place over the ballot. There should be sample ballots available in large type for persons who are using the accessible voting machine. There should be a large handled stylus if that's needed. And there should be information by telecommunication devices for voters who are deaf. And of course, as we've already talked about, because of HAVA, there should be at least one electronic voting machine with accessibility features, and that includes audio mode for people with visual disabilities. Next slide. We also have available to voters with disabilities here in Illinois something called curbside voting, which I imagine you've all heard of. And so if you vote on election day at your polling place, but you're not able to enter the polling place because it's not accessible, or because you have some mobility limitations that would prevent you from entering the polling place, you can request to vote curbside. And as with getting help with voting, for curbside voting, there need to be 2 election judges involved, one from each major political party, and they will bring the ballot out to you. You know, you may be in your vehicle, you may be on foot, you may be in a wheelchair or scooter, however you approach the polling place, but you have to be within 50 feet of the polling place. They're not required to come out, you know, great distances to offer curbside voting. And then the judges bring the ballot out to you, you mark the ballot, you give it back to the election judges, and they are responsible to make sure that it's counted inside the polling place. And one thing I'd like to add here is that curbside voting is not a substitute for making a polling place accessible. And while it may not be so frequent currently, in the past, I think that this option was overused and used perhaps as an excuse for making the polling place self-accessible. And it is not a substitute for that. Next slide.
Yes, do you want to entertain a couple statements? or
Absolutely.
questions? So one attendee says, sample ballots are usually visible on the local election authority site. And someone else comments, sometimes the sample voting ballot did not have all the candidates or voting laws. What way can you ensure you have the latest sample voting ballot? Is there an amended date on the sample ballot? Last primary election, this situation occurred and caused me not to be able to be a thorough informed voter.
And honestly, I don't know the answer to that. The only thing that I would say is that if you got a sample ballot, maybe immediately before the election, to follow up with your local election office and say, I received a sample ballot on this date, and I'm calling to see if it has been revised or updated in any way. And if so, how can I get a copy of that? That's the only thing that I can suggest. If others out there have other ideas, please feel free to speak up. So if you want to utilize curbside voting, the best thing to do is to call your local election authority and make that request at least one day before the election. It may be possible to arrange for curbside voting on election day, but do not assume that it will be available. Call before you go to your polling place and make the request to use curbside voting, and to make sure that they will accommodate that request. So a couple of final things, and then we'll open it up for any further questions. There are provisions in Illinois election law that allow a resident of a nursing home who has lived there for more than 14 days before the election to request a vote by mail ballot. And if that happens, at least 2 elections, again, 1 from each political party, will come to the nursing home either the Friday, Saturday, Sunday, or Monday before election day and supervise the voting. And so if that is something you should request of your local election office when you register to vote or when you're ready to vote, so that they can make those arrangements. And you'll vote using a vote by mail ballot, but of course you'll be voting, on site at the nursing facility. And the election judges then are required to return the ballot to be counted. Please. There's also provision in the Illinois Election Code for people who are admitted to a healthcare facility less than 14 days before the election. And a healthcare facility includes a hospital, a nursing home, or a rehabilitation center. If that should occur, you can still vote. You have to get from your election authority something called an application for ballot for qualified voter admitted to hospital, nursing home, or rehabilitation center, and fill it out. And there is also a section on the form for your doctor to complete, and he or she must sign the form as well.
This is Tara.
Yeah.
Cheryl, do ICF or DDs fall under the nursing home category when it comes to voting?
I think any facility that's licensed under the Nursing Home Care Act would fall within this provision. So if that is the case, then I would say yes, because I know it can also apply to, I think, MCDDs, and it can apply to SMRFs, which are specialized mental health rehabilitation facilities. So if they are governed by the Illinois Nursing Home Care Act, then I would say yes, whatever that facility is. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. If you're going to vote while in a healthcare facility, you will have to have a legal relative or a registered voter who lives in the same precinct that you do. Go in person to your local election office to hand in the election form, ballot to deliver to you. You can then, upon delivery, vote the ballot and place it in the envelope that is provided by the election office. And then the same person who got that ballot for you must return it to the local election authority before 7:00 p.m. on election day. And so now we're getting to Equip for Equality's election day helpline. I mentioned before that, there are other options for reporting or trying to resolve a problem that you encounter on election day. And so this is certainly an option. We, on all primary elections and general elections, have staff available by telephone to answer questions about any voting problems that you may have on election day. And so for this election on November 8th, our helpline will be up and running from 6 a.m. to 7 p.m., which are the same hours that the polls are open. And I have included toll-free telephone numbers and TTY numbers that can be used for that purpose. And so I should also say that you can also contact the Illinois Attorney General's office with regard to possible rights violations that are related to voting. There are, various places that you can report and that would investigate or, attempt to resolve an issue. So those are other options for problems that occur day of. And I should say that when we answer questions about voting problems, if we are able, we will attempt to go to the source to try to resolve it that day. Obviously, depending on the problem, that may not be possible. But there are many things that come up that maybe are not being done appropriately or not being done at all, that if we would then contact the election authority and notify them of that, they can take steps then while voting is still going on to take care of it. And so we certainly are happy to do that and will do it if it's possible. And so I guess I will conclude by saying, whether you vote in person or you vote by mail, be sure to vote in the November 8th election. Again, I know I'm preaching to the choir, but this is just so important and is an opportunity that we simply should not overlook. So thank you all to Silk and Shelley for inviting me to come today, and thank you all for participating and being interested in this really important topic. And if there's any further questions today, please ask them. And if you have any questions that come to mind, after this webinar is over, please reach out and don't hesitate to contact me. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. And while we're waiting for this last couple of minutes to see if anybody else has any questions, I want to let you know that this webinar has been recorded, and within 1 week it will be available on our website, which is Silk, S-I-L-C of Illinois, all spelled out, silkofillinois.org. Also, we had a little problem with getting the slide deck out to everybody ahead of this presentation, but if you would like a copy of the slides, if you will just email Tara, who will put her email in the chat now. If you will email her asking for those, we would be glad to forward those to you. I realize this was a lot of information that we covered, but that's the reason we like to record when we can, so that you can go back and listen to it again.
This is Tara. I don't have any questions right now other than thank yous for your time.
Oh, thank you all. It was my pleasure.
All right. I just want to make a comment before we close. I wish that in the earlier days, back in the really early days of my life, when I was just in my 20s, that was a long time ago, I was an election judge for several elections, and I wish that we had more education to the judges on how to handle things like that in the polling place, because unfortunately it seemed like I spent at every election having to educate my fellow judges on how to assist people with disabilities. And I know that I came across places that were even hesitant to put up the accessible voting booth, and I've had to argue with other judges on doing that and making sure that it had been set up properly. I also had witnessed one judge wanting to interfere with a young lady because she presented with her parents, and the judge didn't think that she should be voting because she didn't think she had the cognitive ability. And also, while working for Impact, I know we had a consumer that had a guardian that made it very clear to us that he didn't want this man voting because he didn't think he knew what he was talking about. And I had to do some education that, in fact, if this young man wanted to go vote, he should be given every opportunity to go and do that. So I've seen a lot of the problems on the ground. I've seen the inaccessible voting areas, things like that. So I'm very, very thankful that we now have permanent voting by mail that has come up. And I indeed have taken advantage of that. And I think it's just very helpful and alleviates the need for rides to the polling place and things like that. So I can see over the years how things have come along, but we still have a long way to go. I want to say that here in Illinois, we have a lot of freedoms that we are seeing being taken away by other states. And there is, courses, cases at our both state level courts and at our Supreme Court level about these very issues. So I want to make sure that I'm exercising my every opportunity to vote as a citizen of this country. And I just feel like that we should vote as if our life depended on it, because quite frankly, it may well depend on it. It is that important. Elections are that important.
I would say, Shelley, that not that it may well, it does. And that's what Justin Dart used to say. It's just vote as if your life depends on it, because it does. And it's true. And it's true in so many ways. And what you just talked about just triggered something in my mind that I hope you won't mind if I add. And that is, I really think, I don't know if any of you have ever acted as an election judge. I have a number of times. And it is a very educational experience for you as an election judge, but it is also a great opportunity to educate others about the rights of voters with disabilities. And I think it's really important that more people with disabilities serve as election judges. And I would encourage you to encourage others to do that, because it's just, another way that we can, provide information and training so that voters with disabilities aren't faced with, inappropriate assumptions or, discriminatory practices or, an outright denial of rights, and consider it. I really think it's a worthwhile thing to do. It's a really long day, but I think it's a very worthwhile experience. So think about it.
I would agree. Okay, Terry, do we have any last things in the questions or comments?
We do. A comment, yes, I agree. The voting judges need extra training and updates on the voting laws. And another question, what are some social media toolkits we can use to encourage people with disabilities in Illinois to vote and know their voting rights? Do you have links to toolkits? And
nothing comes to mind at the moment, I'm sorry to say. Shelley, I don't know if you're
You do have some links in your website.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. We have voting information on our website. I was thinking of outside of Equip for Equality. And our website is, equipforequality.org. And I'm sure there are others. I know that you've probably heard of the Rev Up campaign, which is all about voting and people with disabilities. And it's national, but I do think they have some resources that are state specific. So, that's certainly something you could look at as well.
And they do. And if you'll just put Rev Up or Get Out the Vote into your search engine, you will come across those things. I believe the Arc of Illinois has some good information written in plain language. You need to check on their website. Okay. Well, I want to thank you all very much for your time again today. Thanks to our interpreters. Thanks to our CART person. And thanks again to Cheryl and Tara for all her technical assistance today. And we'll sign off and have a great afternoon.
All right.
Thank you all.
Bye, everyone, and thank you.
Bye.